Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my academy. My name is Soma, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of my usual scripted content, I thought this time I would actually do an unscripted response video to this recent upload by the channel Atlas Pro. Now, for those of you who don't know, I actually have a master's degree in pre-colonial West African history, and I've been studying African history in my free time for years at this point. So, watching this video, I noticed a few glaring errors. Now, to make it clear, this is not an attack video on Atlas Pro. I really like the channel Atlas Pro, and I hope that if Atlas Pro sees this, he doesn't take this as an insult of any kind. I feel like he's probably the type of person who would take it in stride to be corrected, but, you know, just in case, let's be clear, not an attack video. I like Atlas Pro, just a correction. So what I thought we'd do today is just go through this video. I've already seen this, so this isn't a blind reaction. I have some notes here of a few things I'd like to touch on as we're going through, and we're just going to go through this video and make a few corrections, a few nitpicks, clarify some things, and maybe include some fun facts along the way. Now, before we get into this, I want to make note, I am going to probably be cutting some parts out of this video because this isn't supposed to be a substitute for watching the original, so please go ahead and watch the original video. I don't want to be, taking views away from Atlas Pro, and you won't miss anything that I cut out that way. So, without further ado, let's get right into this video.
Last year, I showed you all this map of Africa from 1935 so that we could learn more about the colonial apparatus that had the continent in its grips at this time. And I thought this turned out to be a pretty good video, as it definitely got more views than most of my recent ones, so clearly you all did too. But I also got a lot of comments complaining that the video was too Eurocentric, which I guess is fair. For what was supposed to be a video about Africa, I did end up talking mostly about Europeans' actions here. But also, that was kind of the point, to illustrate how decisions made by European powers nearly a century ago continue to affect politics on the continent today. Though okay, yeah, sure, I get what you're saying. A map like this, with its colonial borders and colonial place names, completely fails to communicate anything about the people who actually lived here during this period.
And I'm just going to pause it here to say that this is why I think Atlas Pro would probably take a video like this in stride. Like, I really appreciate how he's engaging with some of the criticisms of that previous video, even if he doesn't fully agree with them. So, it feels to me like he's probably the type of person who would enjoy having some new information shared with him through this video.
That is a map of Africa if I've ever seen one. What did I find? I found this map titled Johnson's Africa. Dated to the year 1866, that makes this 69 years older than this, and places this map 20 years prior to the infamous Berlin Conference and the formalization of the scramble for Africa, giving us a glimpse of the continent mere moments before it would be forever altered by colonialism, when it was still home to its own kingdoms, caliphates, empires, nations, and more. So let's try this again and see what else we can learn about Africa circa 1866. Alright, just like last time, we're going to start all the way up here in the northwestern corner of the continent. Today, this region doesn't really have a general name, at least not in English.
Okay, so pausing here, he says at least not in English, but there is a term for this region. It is Maghreb, which is obviously not an English term, but neither is Morocco or Algeria or the Sahara. These are all borrowed words. But Maghreb is an accepted term for Africa west of Egypt, or North Africa west of Egypt, I mean. So there is a general term for this region to this day.
But 150 years ago, this area was well known as Barbary. This name comes from the nomadic Berber people who have been known to live throughout these areas pretty much since time immemorial. Although this name has drifted out of use today, back when it was properly in use, Barbary was known around the world as a hub for piracy. The main business of the Barbary pirates, ironically enough, was the capture and trade of enslaved people they obtained by raiding villages along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. In the centuries prior to this map's making, over 1 million people were stolen from what would become Spain, France, and Italy and sold in North African markets to Arab Muslim buyers.
Okay, so 2 things on that. First of all, it's worth noting that although, like he says, the significant majority of enslaved people captured from Europe were being taken from southern Europe, the Barbary pirates actually did go a lot further afield. There were instances where they would go out into the Atlantic Ocean and attack countries in Western and even Northern Europe. In fact, the furthest they got was to Iceland, so very, very far from the Mediterranean. So while the majority of enslaved people were coming from those southern European regions, not all of them were from those places. Also, not all of the buyers would have been Arab Muslims, so the majority probably were, but keep in mind they are bordering on the Ottoman Empire, which is an ethnically diverse region controlled by Turks. So while Arab Muslims would have been a lot of the buyers in North Africa itself, there would have also been groups like Turks and other ethnic groups from the Ottoman Empire buying enslaved people.
This is important to understand because the Barbary slave trade was one of the main justifications Europeans used to launch military campaigns of their own into these areas, as they saw conquering their opposing coastlines as the only way to defend themselves.
Okay, so I'm going to pause right here to issue sort of a clarification/correction, because the way he phrases this makes it sound like the Europeans actually believed this, which is not necessarily true. So it is absolutely true that concern about Barbary slave raids were a compelling factor in Europeans launching military campaigns into North Africa, and they were certainly a justification that Europeans used for colonial efforts. However, it is very, very important to note that the height of the Barbary slave trade was in the mid-17th century, or the early to mid-17th century. So by the time that European powers actually started establishing colonies, that Barbary slave trade had largely, if not entirely, died out. It was more a relic of the past, right? Like, by the end of the 18th century, it had heavily shrunk down. And by the 19th century, you barely had anything, right? It wasn't a major threat to Europeans at all. So while they were using that as an ideological justification for colonization, it's not necessarily that they actually felt that they needed to do that. It's not actually a case where it's like that was the only way they could see to defend themselves, because by that time, that was not an ongoing threat to most Europeans. So yeah, it's important to note the difference between justifications provided and actual sentiments held.
Though by this time, the only European power to have succeeded at this was France, having secured Algeria 3 decades earlier.
And for this, I want to note that talking about Algeria being secured is, it's not wrong, of course. I don't want to, I don't want to say that the terminology makes it wrong here, but I do think that kind of, it glosses over a lot, because he's talking about, the Barbary slave trade and how, many, many people were enslaved and sold. And that's, horrible. But when he talks about Algeria, he kind of glosses over it. So I want to note that the French called this the pacification of Algeria. It was a long process, and through the quote-unquote pacification of Algeria, approximately 500,000 to 1 million people were killed. And that is out of a population of 3 million people overall. So this was a hugely violent event. And just talking about securing, I feel kind of glosses over that. So I think it's very worth noting how much destruction was involved in this conquest of Algeria.
And I find it interesting that even before Africa's colonial period had really gotten underway, the states of the Barbary Coast were organized pretty much the same way they are now, something that might help explain the relative stability of these countries post-decolonization. Though moving east, we'll find what's now Libya was divided into two states, Tripoli and Fezzan, which, if you ask me, is a smart way to organize this region.
So the thing is, they are not two states. This is actually just one state, the Ottoman province of Tripoli. Fezzan was not an independent state, it was actually a district within the province of Tripoli. So while these are shown as two independent entities on the map, really Fezzan falls within Tripoli. And it was functionally sort of independent. They did organize a lot of their own activities, but it was officially under the control of Tripoli. So that sort of independence is probably why it's shown as a distinct, or in a distinct color on this map, but very worth noting, actually officially part of Tripoli, not an independent state.
The Tripolitanians shared a similar coastal identity, living in cities and farming what arable land there was, whereas the desert-dwelling Fezzan people lived completely different lifestyles, being a mostly nomadic, pastoral people. Seeing it like this, I hope you can begin to understand how making one country from what was once 2 or 3 unrelated territories has proven so problematic.
So the point still stands because Fezzan was, of course, a distinct region, not necessarily a state, but it was a distinct region within Tripoli, and it was, at one point conquered by Tripoli. That's how it was incorporated into Tripoli. So it still stands that this is, a variety of different territories that had been united into one state, but that uniting happened prior to the modern-day state of Libya. Tripoli itself was a province of the Ottoman Empire, which included Fezzan as a district.
Besides that, we'll find an Egyptian state very similar to the one that exists here today. The ruler at this time, however, was Ismail Pasha, whose title was also neither a sultan, king, or bey, but rather khedive, making this the Khedivate of Egypt. While at this point it might seem like North Africa was home to all sorts of cool and uniquely native styles of governance, the truth is none of these states were actually independent, but rather they were all tributary states to the Ottoman Empire. That's what this red boundary indicates, the extent of Ottoman sovereignty, which was only broken by France's incursion into Algeria. To be honest, I'm not quite sure if the Ottomans' presence here counts as European colonialism per se, but it definitely was a form of foreign rule that had its base of operations pretty much in Europe, though at the same time, the Europeans certainly didn't see it this way, as they would later make it their goal to totally expel the Ottomans from the continent. Though at least when this map was made, this had not yet happened, and the Ottomans were simply in severe decline, which actually afforded these states a fair degree of autonomy. The Khedive of Egypt, for example, was independent enough to launch a military campaign of his own into neighboring Nubia, even so far as Sennar, on paper bringing these lands under Ottoman control, but functionally making them an Egyptian colony. To put it bluntly, the purpose of this conquest was again to amass slaves, as the ruling Khedive was hoping to raise an army of Nubian slave soldiers to fight against the Ottomans occupying his country.
So this is partly true, but also worth noting that the slave army was not the only goal of these conquests. Another was gold, because Nubia had been associated with gold forever, even the name Nubia, that comes from the ancient Egyptian language, and probably comes from the ancient Egyptian word for gold, because this was a major gold mining region. So part of that reason for Egyptian conquests in Nubia were in pursuit of gold. But yes, pursuing enslaved people to make soldiers out of was also a major factor.
Beyond Nubia are several smaller states such as Darfur, Kordofan, and Sennar, each fall.
Kordofan is not a state, it is a region. I think that's probably why it's shown without a border here. If you notice, it's like, it looks like it's a slightly different color from the desert, but it is not marked off with a border. Kordofan, not a state. It was a region with a variety of different peoples in it. So not a single sovereign entity.
On different sides of red lines, which I hope illustrates how each of these areas hosted people from different ethnic groups who follow different religions and speak different languages.
Okay, small correction there. Almost all of these people were Muslim. So yes, they spoke different languages, yes, there were a variety of different ethnic groups, but most of them followed the same religion.
Nevertheless, these sultanates would eventually be grouped together with Nubia into the British Sudan colony, helping to explain why the modern country of Sudan continues to struggle with maintaining unity. In fact, you can actually see what were once the lands of Kordofan and Sennar lines up almost perfectly with the borders of the world's youngest nation, South Sudan.
Okay, so to clarify, I'm not sure what he meant by this exactly, but to make it clear, Sennar and Kordofan are both, for the most part, in what is now Sudan, not in South Sudan. So if he meant that the border of South Sudan lines up with the southern border of these regions, that's pretty close. It's a little off, but it's pretty close. But Kordofan and Sennar themselves are within. For the most part, there's some, the line is not exact with the regions, but for the most part, they are within Sudan, not South Sudan.
Meanwhile, what's left of Sudan is currently fighting another civil war, this time between East and West, or really between what was once Nubia and Darfur. Once again, I hope you can see how the historic divisions preserved on maps like this continue to affect the world today.
Okay, so I don't want to get too into it because this is getting into modern politics. It's a really complicated situation, but I do think that the way he frames that is kind of misleading about the ongoing civil war in Sudan. Once again, not going to get into all the details, but basically the people who are currently ruling over Darfur, the Darfur region, which is still a region within Sudan, they are not representing like the vestiges of this long-lasting Darfuri identity, right? So this isn't the civil war is not a division between regions. It is a division between two factions that were previously working together to take over the government of Sudan. And one of these factions, the one that is currently ruling Darfur, is, I'm being cautious with my phrasing, they are doing terrible, terrible things to the Darfuri population. So I don't want to, gloss over the fact that they are distinct from this Darfuri identity. There are a variety of ethnic groups in Darfur that are non-Arabs. The majority of people in Sudan identify as Arabs, or the dominant ethnic group in Sudan is Arabs, whereas in Darfur, Arabs are a smaller group among many. And currently, the people ruling over Darfur are essentially an Arab supremacist militia, and they're doing very, very bad things to the non-Arab demographics of that region. So, don't want to gloss over this, don't want to oversimplify this by suggesting that the ongoing civil war is simply a result of these older divisions. It is a lot more complicated than that.
Below the Tibu is the name Kanem, no doubt a reference to the Kanem-Bornu Empire.
Okay, so this is a little backwards. The Kanem-Bornu Empire, or Kanem-Bornu Empire is, I think, more accurate to how the local people pronounce it, but regardless, that empire is named after the two key regions that it ruled over. So Kanem is a region, which was at one point the heartland of an empire. So this name is not in reference to the empire, rather the empire is in reference to this regional name.
Then further west were the lands of the Imoshach or the Tawarer. Although I didn't immediately recognize these names, after some thought I realized today we'd use the terms Amazigh or Tuareg to describe the people here. Related to the Berbers, the Amazigh are again a nomadic people who have...
Okay, so correction here. The Amazigh are not related to the Berbers. The Amazigh and the Berbers are the same people. The term Berber is simply an exonym. It's derived from the Latin word barbarian. So this is often, although not always, considered a pejorative. Some Amazigh people are very happy with using the term Berber. It's a very long established term, but others consider it insulting and prefer to use the term Amazigh or Imaziren. And these are endonyms, so these are coming from the people themselves. Of course, the Amazigh people are not a single group. There is a diverse range of them. So they all have sort of different names for themselves. This word Amazigh is derived from one specific language. I don't know which one in particular, but a lot of Amazigh languages have words similar to this, and it basically just means free people. So to draw an analogy, it's kind of like how in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, you have a lot of words that are related to each other, or possibly related to each other, like Cossack and Kazakh, that also mean free people. So it's kind of similar to a situation like that.
While some might try to fault this map for failing to define the boundaries between the Tibu, Tuareg, Zairs, and Amazighs, the truth is, as nomadic peoples who were constantly moving between the oases and wadis, there was no sense of land belonging to any one person or group, but rather whoever happened to be passing through at the time, making their nations practically impossible to define from a lines on maps perspective anyway. And so I'd argue that the lack of borders here is actually more accurate than any line in the sand European explorers could have drawn.
And it's worth noting here, just briefly, once again, don't want to get too much into modern politics, but this is actually a case where those lines on maps do have very clear negative impacts on certain people. Because there are a lot of political conflicts in the Sahel region that directly relate to the borders that have been drawn between different Tuareg groups. So unlike something like the Darfur context, where it's a little dubious the way he frames it, this is actually a very clear case where lines on maps are directly related to a lot of modern-day conflicts.
Once we cross the Sahara, we'll enter a region known at this time as Sudan, which appears to stretch the width of the continent. This might seem strange to some of you, as this name now is associated with just one or two countries, but before that, Sudan was the name attributed to the entire transition zone between the northern desert and the southern forests, an area we know now as the Sahel.
Little known fact, there are actually multiple regions that stretch across the continent of Africa. The Sahel is the transition zone between the desert and the grassland. The grassland is itself actually called the Sudanian grassland. So this term is still preserved in a geographic regional label, other than just the country of Sudan.
Whatever you call it, crossing into the Sudan, farming becomes possible once more, leading to larger population centers surrounded by more organized states with well-defined territories. However, I'll admit I didn't really recognize many of these, as there aren't really any modern-day equivalents to them. So
a lot of these states actually do have modern-day equivalents, but they are not nation-states. They are actually regions within other states, like most notably Nigeria.
This only made me even more curious, and digging a little deeper led me to learn these states were all the result of one of the single most impactful yet overlooked events in all of African history, the Fulani Jihads.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pause here to prepare myself. This is the part where he is going to be very, very wrong. So brace yourself. Basically everything he says for a few minutes after this point is wildly inaccurate, and I'll go over that, but just to be clear, no, these states are not all the result of the Fulani jihads. And I'll go over that in more detail later, but that first premise is wrong. And he is only going to get more wrong. So this is the part that prompted me to actually make this response video, because this gets really, really wrong.
Although Islam arrived to North Africa rather quick after its founding, as always, the Sahara posed an immense boundary for its spread any deeper into the continent.
That's wrong. So first things first, that is false. The Sahara did pose a major barrier to the spread of Islamic armies. However, Islam spread to West Africa almost as soon as it existed, or almost as soon as it spread to North Africa. Basically, it spread straight from the Maghreb into West Africa almost immediately. It took a while to take off there, but it was arriving in West Africa very, very soon. Moreover, on this map, you only see North Africa highlighted. The Horn of Africa also started having an Islamic population very, very early on. The followers of the Prophet Muhammad actually took refuge in Ethiopia for a while, and some of the oldest mosques outside of Asia are in the Horn of Africa. So there is a very long presence of Islam south of the Sahara, going back almost to the very foundations of the religion.
To make matters more difficult, the people on the other side of the desert looked completely different, spoke completely different languages, worshipped completely different idols, and had their own problems to worry about.
Okay, so those factors were not as big of a deal as Atlas Pro seems to imply. Looking completely different, that basically was not a factor in conversions at all. Like, not to say that Muslims never discriminated based on appearance, they absolutely did, but in those early stages of the spread of Islam, plenty of people who we would describe as black converted to Islam. One of the Prophet Muhammad's earliest followers was of sub-Saharan African origin, and many of the earliest Muslims were of sub-Saharan African origin. Moreover, if you're talking about language, that didn't stop Islam from quickly spreading to Egypt, to Persia, into India, and of course into the Maghreb, where most people were speaking languages other than Arabic, right? So the fact that the people south of the Sahara looked different and spoke different languages, not really factors. And the fact that they had very different existing religions, that might have sort of been a factor compared to the monotheistic states that converted to Islam. But if you think about it, like, the Arabian Peninsula was itself majority pagan at the time that Islam was founded, and nevertheless they became Muslim. Similarly, a lot of other pagan populations became partly or entirely Muslim. So very much not a huge obstacle, not an insurmountable obstacle, as this video seems to imply.
Among them were the Fulani people, one of the many ethnic groups spread across West Africa, constantly vying for control against the various other regional powers. However, with the introduction of Islam as a
this group that she's showing on screen, I'm pretty sure this is not Fulani people. So just want to jot that down real quick. I'm not 100% sure what group this is, but it looks like Central Asians to me. I could be off on that, I'm not sure, but I don't think these are Fulani.
However, with the introduction of Islam as a unifying force, the Fulani gained an upper hand against all the rest, allowing them to carry out a wave of religious expansions, or jihads, to establish several Islamic states all across the Sudan,
Okay, so this is wildly wrong. The Fulani people had been majority Muslim for centuries before the Fulani jihads. So it is wildly inaccurate to frame things as Islam giving them a unifying thing that gave them an upper hand on their neighbors. Moreover, most of their neighbors were also Muslim. In the Sahel region, the majority of people were Muslim by the late Middle Ages. This was a majority Muslim region. The Fulani were just one group of many who were Muslim. They were one of the earliest to convert to Islam, but they were one population among many practicing this religion, and it took centuries before those Fulani jihads happened. The Fulani jihads are a complicated subject. Even the term Fulani jihads is a bit controversial because while these tend to be credited to the Fulani, a lot of the jihad movements heavily involved other ethnic groups as well. So it's not necessarily fair to just call them Fulani jihads. Moreover, it's sometimes considered dubious to call them jihads as well. Jihad, obviously just an Arabic term meaning struggle, usually implying religious struggle. These were certainly struggles, they were certainly religious, but they weren't entirely religious. They were also political. So some people prefer the term Fulani revolutions, while other people, of course, oppose using the term Fulani when describing these events, since they didn't exclusively involve the Fulani people. So a lot of complexity there, but overall the important thing is the Fulani were Muslim centuries before the Fulani jihads. The jihads had a lot to do with a variety of factors, including new Islamic thoughts and a bunch of other stuff. Political situations, the slave trade was a factor. So lots of complexities here, but overall, this description is completely wrong.
The state of Messina, for example, could more accurately be described as the Messina Caliphate, and occupied one of the most advantageous positions in the region, including the trading hub of Timbuktu, giving them control over trade routes in and out of the Sahara. Further east, there are even more states, such as Gondo, Sokoto, Bornu, Fombina, Adamawa, Bagirmi, Wade, and Darfur, all founded by Fulani jihadists within the century leading up to this.
So these states were not all founded by Fulani jihadists. Most of them weren't. Messina was founded by Fulani jihadists. Sokoto was founded by Fulani jihadists, and Sokoto, Gondo, and Adamawa, those were all kind of related to each other. So Gondo and Adamawa, those were also founded by Fulani jihadists, but they were kind of offshoots of Sokoto. Now, Bornu, he should know, was not founded by Fulani jihadists. He mentioned the Kanem-Bornu Empire earlier. This was the Kanem-Bornu Empire. We call it the Kanem-Bornu Empire today because at one point it was run from the Kanem region, and at another point it was run from the town of Borno. So we call it Kanem-Borno, or Kanem-Bornu, but it was just one empire that shifted region over time. So this is the same empire, the Borno Empire. It's still there, not founded by Fulani jihadists. It's going back hundreds of years, right? Fombina, that is not a state, that's a region. That is just a region sandwiched between these states. Bagirma, not founded by Fulani jihadists. That was actually founded in 1522, so centuries before the Fulani jihads, or over a century before the first Fulani jihad. Wadai, that was not a Fulani state. That one was founded in around 1635, so that was also well before the Fulani jihads. And Darfur, we've already talked about Darfur. That wasn't founded by Fulanis either. That's like so far east. That is not a Fulani state. So the only of these states that are actually Fulani jihad states are Sokoto, Adamawa, Gondo, and Messina. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Half of the states that he mentioned were not Fulani states, and one of them wasn't a state at all.
What makes the Fulani's adoption of Islam so significant is that although the religion had already been present among the Arabs of the continent, this was the first time ethnically sub-Saharan people were embracing the religion, and represented a foot in the door that could have led to the conversion of the rest of the continent.
Okay, so this is the most absurd comment of this entire video. I'm trying to be well-meaning here. I don't want to, I don't want to make Atlas Pro feel like too bad about this, but this is a serious error. To be clear, this is equivalent to if you were to say that the Germans' adoption of Protestantism in the 16th century was a foot in the door that could have led to the Christianization of the entire continent of Eurasia. That is basically the level we're on. The Fulani were majority Muslim literally centuries before the Fulani jihads, as were many of their neighbors. Basically, every population in the Sahel region was majority Muslim by the 19th century, by the late medieval period, in fact. This was a widely Islamic region, all right? And they'd lived there next to pagan populations further south for centuries, and we hadn't seen the Islamization of the entire continent, right? So this is absolutely absurd. It is as absurd as saying that the Protestant Reformations were the beginning of Christianity in Europe. It is as absurd as saying that the Protestant Reformations were a foot in the door that could have led to all of Eurasia becoming Christian. It is an absurd mistake, to be honest. Just like Europe was mostly Christian, the Protestant Reformation was simply a new strain of Christianity. Similarly, the Fulani jihads were rooted in part in new Islamic doctrines, right? A new form of Islam, people who thought that other Muslims were doing things incorrectly. But these Fulani jihads swept, for the most part, over areas that were already majority Muslim. So it is just completely wrong to suggest that this is the start of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. And if it wasn't obvious enough from that, obviously Arabs were not the only Muslim populations in Africa at this time. Long before this point, most of the Sahel had become Muslim. Also, much of East Africa, in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, most Somalis are Muslim. They don't consider themselves Arab. On the Swahili coast, most people were Muslim. They aren't Arabs. So this idea that it's just Arabs that were Muslim before this point in Africa is just wildly inaccurate.
In other words, this was the moment Islam was starting to bridge the ethno-linguistic divide running through Africa.
Again, completely absurd. Equivalent to saying that Germans converting to Protestantism was the first time that Christianity started bridging the ethnic divide between Levantines and Europeans. Completely wrong.
True instance of cultural exchange. And this is important because the Christian nations of Europe definitely took notice of these jihads. This map is literal evidence of that, and viewed them as another threat to their strategic interests.
Okay, also highly dubious because Europeans had been taking interest in Africa. I mean, okay, to be clear, Europeans knew that many Africans were Muslim. They knew that the Songhai Empire was Muslim. They knew that there were Muslims in Africa. The Fulani jihads may have been a motivating factor in the scramble for Africa to some extent, but Europeans were already trying to conquer Africa centuries before they managed to actually do it. And part of the motivation for this was spreading Christianity in conflict to Islam. But it wasn't because they thought that the Fulani jihads were going to sweep across Africa and turn everyone Muslim. It wasn't because that the ethno-linguistic divide had suddenly been bridged. It was because they'd long held an oppositional stance to Muslims. They'd long had this crusading ideology. As far back as the 14th century, Europeans already were talking about trying to convert people in Africa to Christianity. Already, in the very earliest stages of African exploration, people were talking about trying to convert the Ghana of Ouagadougou. So that is a state in West Africa, in what is now Mauritania and Mali. They wanted to convert the king of that empire to Christianity so that they could form a two-pronged approach against the Moors in North Africa. So this was already an idea going around, the idea of converting Africans to Christianity. And they also had this idea of a guy named Prester John. This was a very long-standing myth going back to the Crusades, although the location where Prester John lived changed over time. But by the early modern period, Europeans generally agreed that Prester John lived somewhere in Africa. Prester John was this mythical Christian king. Part of the reason why Europeans started exploring Africa in the 15th century was in the hopes of making contact with Prester John so that they could have a Christian ally against Muslims in Africa. So this was a very long-standing thing. It did not start with the Fulani jihads. It did not start in the 19th century. It was a long-standing ideological justification for attempted conquests in Africa.
Their thinking went that if Islam continued to gain power and influence throughout the continent, then so would their adversary, the Ottomans. Therefore, the only way to combat this...
Worth noting, this picture, I don't know if it's by Cavazzi. It might be by Cavazzi. Not sure. Not sure about this particular picture, but this is a 17th or 18th century image from West Central Africa. So this is well before the Fulani jihads and in a completely different region. This is a Central African picture of missionaries evangelizing there. The Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa already had a Christian elite centuries before the Fulani jihads. So once again, this was already a well-established thing in Africa.
This would be to increase their own religious activity in Africa and start spreading Christianity instead, which I'll admit is another insight I didn't really have until studying this map.
And it's wrong. To be clear, it's wrong. Europeans already had this missionary zeal long before the scramble for Africa, long before the Fulani jihads. They were already trying to convert Africans to Christianity. This was a long-standing thing.
Europeans were so threatened by the rise of these Afro-Islamic states that they launched their own crusades onto the continent with a virtually identical goal of not only conquering but converting new subjects. And I really want us to reflect on that for a second. How big a role religion, and specifically the tension between Christianity and Islam, played in the carving up of Africa. I feel like that's not discussed enough.
And he's right on that. It did play a huge role in the colonization of Africa, but not in the scramble for Africa. This was a long-standing thing. This was going back to the earliest explorations of Africa, earliest European explorations of Africa in the 15th century. The idea of exploring Africa, partly as an element of the perceived contest between Muslims and Christians, that was a very long-standing thing, not something that developed in the 19th century.
So now it's finally starting to make sense why so many zealous missionaries accompanied colonial projects. I also think this helps explain why none of these states are reflected in the modern borders of Africa, as this area was later conquered entirely by the French, who did their best to erase all memory of these early Islamic states.
Okay, so that's another element where he's getting stuff wrong. One, this area was not entirely conquered by the French. A chunk of what is shown on screen here was also conquered by the British, including a large chunk of the Sokoto Caliphate that's seen here. So there were also British colonies conquering much of this region. Secondly, the French didn't really successfully convert this region, which is really noteworthy. Most of these areas are still majority Muslim to this day, as they were then, as they were hundreds of years before the Fulani jihads. The French did not mass convert these areas. They did not try to completely erase the previously existing states. So that history did get glossed over a lot. It did get, partly erased by colonial powers, but the other thing is that some of these states still have existing institutions in modern African states, like Sokoto. Sokoto still has a leader. That's still a thing in the modern day country of Nigeria, which was a British colony, not a French one, once again. So it's not quite what he's saying here. He seems to be speculating here, and he's not correct.
Below this block of caliphates, we'll reach the coast of Guinea, where we'll find more countries outlined in red. The first is Senegambia. This may sound familiar, as this is where the modern countries of Senegal and Gambia are now found. Next to this is the country of Liberia, which was perhaps the newest and strangest nation in all of Africa by this point. Technically an American colony, Liberia was founded by runaway slaves and freed men escaping oppression in America in the lead up to the Civil War.
Okay, so this is a little dubious. Liberia was founded by the American Colonization Society, which was, it certainly involved some free people of color, but the majority of its members were white Americans. You had a mix of people who opposed the existence of slavery and thought that formerly enslaved people would be better off in Africa to escape the racism of American society. And you had people who were very committed to the retention of slavery and thought that having free people of color in American society threatened that. So they supported sending them away, basically. So you had a mix of people who were anti-racist, sort of, who wanted, like, what they thought was best for black people, and you had racists who wanted what they thought was best for white supremacy, working together to found Liberia. Now, the population of Liberia was mostly made up of formerly enslaved people, not necessarily runaway slaves, that's a bit dubious, but free people of color, so that would include people of mixed race, that would include people who had been freed for various reasons, and people who were emancipated when different states abolished slavery locally. So you had a variety of free people of color in the United States, and some of them joined with the American Colonization Society to found Liberia. So they formed the settler population in Liberia, but they weren't necessarily the driving force in founding Liberia. That was mostly white people of various political persuasions. And also, it wasn't really in the lead up to the Civil War. Liberia was founded quite a while before the Civil War and actually gained its independence a few decades before the Civil War. So, not really the lead up, more like in the aftermath of the American Revolution. I mean, that's, it's like kind of halfway between the American Revolution and the Civil War is when most of this Liberian colonization was occurring.
In fact, now that I think about it, since the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, this being made in 1866 means that from this point on, Liberia would no longer be receiving freed African slaves, marking the end of its colonial period.
So Liberia's colonial period ended before this point. Once again, it gained independence in the 1840s. So it was no longer a colony at that point. It was still receiving settlers, but it was an independent country at that point. It was its own settler state, kind of like how, you can think of it kind of like how the United States continued to colonize westward, but it wasn't part of its colonial period after it became independent from Great Britain.
It's hard to imagine what people would have thought about the creation of this new African state. Some saw it as an exciting experiment in the emancipation of enslaved people, while others saw it as a means of expelling those most likely to stir up a slave rebellion, therefore actually helping to uphold the institute of slavery.
Okay, so he actually did touch on that. I forgot about that. So he touched on that, but he didn't really mention that these people were the driving force in founding Liberia, not just onlookers thinking about what it represented.
Beyond Liberia, we'll find these three states included under a single red line: Ashanti, Dahomey, and Yariba. Of these, Ashanti was perhaps the most well-known, as it had organized itself into an empire prior to Europeans' arrival, and at
the Asante Empire was actually founded in the 17th century, and it only expanded to the coast even later. So Europeans had been arriving in Africa or in West Africa, I should say, since the 15th century. So this was long, long after Europeans started arriving, before, of course, European colonization, but well after European arrival.
The time of making this was under the rule of Kwaka Duopanan, an ambitious ruler dedicated to expanding the Ashanti domain into neighboring lands. This fighting spirit is what enabled the Ashanti to resist British colonial efforts on 4 separate occasions, starting in the 1820s, then the 1860s, 1870s, and 1890s, each time repelling British forces in a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. It was only on their 4th and 5th campaigns in 1903 that the British were finally able to establish a foothold on the coast, and from there claim control over the Ashanti, making them one of the very last African nations to succumb to colonial rule.
Oh, and worth noting, pronunciation isn't that important, but it is pronounced Asante. Asante. The British, when they arrived, this is how it's been explained to me at least, I haven't verified this, they heard it as Ashanti. So that's why it's spelled with an H, but it is Ashanti. Asante, not Ashanti. It doesn't matter that much as long as everyone knows what you mean, but I thought I might as well point it out while I'm talking about this video.
Next to that is the state of Dahomey. Now, we already learned about this kingdom a little in my previous video, but technically that was French Dahomey, whereas this is the independent kingdom of Dahomey, currently under the rule of King Glele.
This picture is not King Glele, for the record. This is actually a picture of King Gezo, who was Glele's father. So, just for the record, not Glele. I don't know why he used this picture.
Who presided over another incredibly wealthy African kingdom.
He even... Wait, it looks like, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at the original image for a while, but notice the blurred text at the bottom. I think that label might even identify this as King Gezo, so I don't know why this image was used.
Glele made his fortunes by launching raids into surrounding lands and bringing captured people back to coastal markets for sale to European merchant ships. And it was from the Dahomey slave markets that most Africans bought and brought across the Atlantic to America originated.
Well, that's just very, very wrong. I opened this ahead of time. This website is slavevoyages.org, and this helps track some data on the transatlantic slave trade. So if you look here in Bight of Benin, this website includes Dahomey in Bight of Benin. So Benin, the Bight of Benin is a body of water that's named after the Kingdom of Benin, but the modern-day country of Benin, where Dahomey was located, is also located on the Bight of Benin. So that is where we'll be including these numbers for Dahomey's slave markets, right? Now, Dahomey conquered up to the coast in, I believe, 1725. So let's start in 1725, or let's do 24 in case I'm rounding up. So 1724 to 1866, you can see that from the Bight of Benin, in that entire time period, an estimated 438,147 people were exported from the Bight of Benin as enslaved people. That is compared to a total of around 3,697,000 people. So overall, definitely not the majority of people. And that is just... Oh wait, let me include USA here. So that doesn't change the numbers too much. That gets a little closer to 4 million total. But that is if you include Great Britain, France, and the USA. If you cut out France and just do Great Britain and the USA, it's 170,000 nearly out of over 2 million. So by no accounts did the majority of enslaved people brought to the Americas or the United States of America come from the port of Dahomey. That is just like completely off.
After this is Yoruba, another African country not exactly represented by any modern borders. During this time, however, the Yoruba people were organized into what's now called the Oyo Empire, ruled not by a Bey or Khedive, but rather the Alafin.
So, the Yoruba people were not just organized into one state. Worth noting, the Oyo Empire was the largest of the Yoruba states at this time, so it included a great many Yoruba people, but not necessarily all of them. So that's worth noting.
When this map was made, over to his brother Adjaye Alowolodu, who would serve as the last sovereign ruler of the Yoruba people before the British came knocking, though at this time their main threat was still the neighboring Dahomey, who continued to raid their villages.
Worth noting, the Oyo Empire actually ruled over Dahomey for a while, or Dahomey was a vassal state to the Oyo Empire for quite a while. So I do hesitate with this framing that makes it just seem like Dahomey were always the aggressors. You know, they had a rivalry that was not just down to one attacking the other.
Continuing south along the shore, we'll enter the region known as Lower Guinea, where there's another series of coastal kingdoms. First is the kingdom of Loango. Below that was the kingdom of Congo, then Angola, Bengay, Mosamide, Ovampo, Damara, and finally Great Namakwa land. I found this really interesting as I only recognized two of these names, Congo and Angola, which apparently were only some of the many kingdoms vying for regional dominance, though as we can see, by this time no one had really won out. It wouldn't be until the Portuguese empowered the king of Congo, known as the Manicongo, through trading guns in exchange for slaves that the Manicongo would gain the upper hand on his neighbors and establish Congo as the biggest regional power.
Alright, so this is a very perplexing thing to say. The Portuguese had been in this region for centuries at this point, interacting with the kings of Congo and other neighboring kingdoms. In fact, the Kingdom of Angola, seen to the south of Congo, was not an independent state. That was, in fact, a Portuguese colony. So it's very strange how he's framing this as something recent. It's also kind of the exact opposite of what happened historically. Congo was the dominant kingdom in this region prior to the Portuguese arriving. Neighboring kingdoms like Ndongo, which I'll explain more in a bit, were actually vassals of the Congo kingdom. And when the Portuguese started coming to the West Central African coast, kingdoms like Ndongo had to go through Congo in order to interact with them. So Congo actually lost dominance over time as kingdoms like Ndongo broke away and became independent. So this is a really strange thing to say. The Portuguese did trade guns to Congo, but they also traded them to other kingdoms. It didn't give the Congo a leg up, so I don't know what he's really thinking of here. Moreover, the kingdoms surrounding Congo were kingdoms like Ndongo, which you may notice is absent on this map. That is because the majority of the Kingdom of Ndongo was conquered by Portugal and founded as the Kingdom of Angola, which is not an indigenous state. It is a Portuguese colony.
Time of our map's printing, the Manicongo on the throne was Pedro Elelo. As his name suggests, Pedro was a product of the Portuguese meddling that had been taking place here since the 1500s, and eventually would be the first Manicongo.
15th century, not 1500s. The Portuguese arrived in, I think around the 1480s is when they first arrived in West Central Africa.
To submit to being a Portuguese vassal. The story is very similar for Angola, which until this point had always been a lesser African kingdom.
Okay, once again, Angola was not an indigenous kingdom. There were kingdoms in this region. Most of what became Angola was previously Ndongo. And you can see on this map, if you can see my mouse here, the kingdom of Matamba, that ultimately became conquered or taken over by the kings of, or queens rather, by the queens of Ndongo. And if you check my channel, I have a video about Queen Njinga of Ndongo, where you can have more details about this topic.
Even a tributary state to the Congo, that is until the Portuguese arrived and established their own colony here. Their purpose was again the acquisition of slaves to be brought to work on Brazilian plantations, leading Angola to launch numerous raids into the lands further south, expanding the colony of Angola until it had consumed the rest of these lesser states, erasing names like Bengay, Mosamide, Ovampo, and Damara from the map for good.
Okay, so a few issues here. One, as I mentioned, the colony of Angola was Angola. The Portuguese sometimes called states in this region Angola, which is actually derived from the title of the ruler, which is Angola, but the colony of Angola is the proper Angola. There was no actual state of Angola in this region prior to Portuguese colonization. Atlas Pro seems to be mixing a few things together here, because Angola, the colony, did expand into a lot of this territory, although not everything that he just said it did. However, that was not part of the slave raiding, which he's mixing some things up here. The colony of Angola expanded eastward from the coast. across the territory that had previously been primarily ruled by the Kingdom of Ndongo. So Angola expanded inland. Meanwhile, further south, you have different Portuguese colonies. Benguela was a Portuguese colony itself. So when you see it on this map, it has already been colonized by Portugal. It is already a Portuguese colony, along with Angola. Similarly, Mossamedes was a Portuguese colony. In fact, there was no state of Mossamedes. That was purely a Portuguese colony. It was an assembly of different polities in that region that were united into the Portuguese colony. So that wasn't even the name of a state that predated the Portuguese. And you may notice that underneath Mossamedes, there is a red line. I'm pretty sure that is delineating the southern border of Portuguese territory, because the Ovambo people, who were not a state, that's an ethnic group, not a state, and the Damara people, also an ethnic group, not a state, they were never colonized by the Portuguese. Their territories were actually colonized by Germany during the scramble for Africa, and ultimately became what is now Namibia. So not part of Angola, never part of Angola, and never colonized by the Portuguese.
Moving to the opposite side of the continent lands us in the Horn of Africa, where we'll find another significant state, Abyssinia, the predecessor to Ethiopia.
Now, Abyssinia is not the predecessor to Ethiopia. Abyssinia is Ethiopia. The name Abyssinia, that is an exonym, and that was very commonly used in European sources at the time. It's derived from an Arabic name, which is itself derived from the word Habesha, which is sort of an ethnic umbrella, referring to several of the major groups in this region. But the official name of this state was Ethiopia, which is derived from Greek. In Greek, the term Ethiopia refers to basically sub-Saharan Africa. It's a little more complicated than that, but more or less corresponds to sub-Saharan Africa. In the Bible, the term Ethiopia is often used to refer to what we'd call Nubia, or the Kingdom of Kush. But because this term was used in a fairly positive light in the Bible, Ethiopia, the country, when they converted to Christianity, they would later adopt this name of Ethiopia or Ethiopia as their official name. So the name Ethiopia was used inside of Ethiopia centuries before it became normalized as the English name for this country. Whereas Abyssinia is an exonym, it was never used internally. So not the predecessor, it literally is Ethiopia, it is the Empire of Ethiopia, which ultimately became the modern-day Federation of Ethiopia, not a different state.
Although the red line encircling it implies unity, for some reason Abyssinia is the only country to be broken up into its constituent territories.
Not quite. As we've talked about already, up in what became Libya, Fezzan was actually part of Tripoli, not an independent territory. So that was actually a district within the province of Tripoli. And if you look just above Abyssinia, you'll notice Sennar and Nubia are rendered as separate from Egypt, even though they were under Egyptian control at the time. If you also look over at the previously discussed Portuguese colonies, they all have independent titles, even though they're all Portuguese colonies and they're surrounded by red. So it's not quite that. This is a slightly odd case because it just has the name Abyssinia, but all of the constituent parts are just in different colors. So that is unusual. But once again, this is not the only instance of a state that is rendered as multiple constituent parts.
This may hint toward the fact that Abyssinia wasn't a true nation, but rather an empire formed from the conquest of numerous small states.
This would also be true of many of the other countries that we've talked about, such as the Asante Empire and many others, so this is a little bit of a dubious explanation.
Beyond Abyssinia, we'll find the lands of Somalis, which has also been left colorless, seemingly implying this wasn't thought of as an organized nation yet, but rather a collection of people of similar ethnic groups,
So, this is not just implied by the fact that it doesn't have a border, but also by the name. He reads it as Somalis. It's Somalis. The people are the Somalis, the Somali people. So he kind of missed that. It's labeled as Somalis, not the land of Somalis.
Rahuan, the Marahan, the Wagadan, the Midjertain, and so on. Seeing how many different people groups shared these lands might help explain why the modern country of Somalia has struggled to maintain unity in the wake of decolonization.
So that is a little dubious. It's worth noting that all of those people are Somalis. They are the same ethnic group. They are different clans, but they're the same ethnic group. So it's a little bit like saying that the fact that Scotland has a clan system explains why Scotland is unstable, which it isn't really. So it's pretty dubious what he just said there. It also kind of gives the lie to the idea that ethnic homogeneity automatically lends itself to stability. Like, a lot of people, when they're talking about Africa, think that instability in African countries follows directly on from ethnic diversity. But no, ethnic variation or ethnic conflicts are certainly a factor in African instability, but being one ethnic group doesn't automatically lend a country stability, as seen in the case of Somalia. And similarly, ethnic variation doesn't automatically make a country unstable. It is just when there are other factors that create conflict, sometimes those conflicts come along ethnic lines.
However, I was surprised to find that what's now the majority of Ethiopia was actually part of this green territory, Galas.
Once again, this is Galas, not Galas. It's not a place called Galas, it is a group of people called the Galas, which I believe he's about to talk about this, but the Galas, that is an outdated term for the Oromo people.
Now, I'll be honest, not a lot of results came up when I googled this name, but once I realized Galas was an antiquated name for the Oromo people, it all started to make sense, as the Oromo are the largest ethnic group in the Horn of Africa and are a mostly nomadic people moving their herds of goats between different parts of the region. And I believe that's why Galas is not outlined in red, as the territory of the Oromo really was impossible to define back then, and so the best map makers could do was include the general area that they were known to be. Another example of how the language of the map actually provides us further insight into the ways of life of the people they depict. I also find it worth noting how what would eventually become Ethiopia was, at this time, split between at least 3 separate territories, mostly along ethnic lines, which I again can't help but feel provides us with some valuable insight into the inner tensions within Ethiopia today.
So that's a little dubious as well, because you may notice that most of what's labeled Abyssinia on this map includes some of the territories that have been divided in Ethiopia today, notably including Eritrea, which is currently an independent country. So that territory is already ethnically diverse, and a lot of the modern-day ethnic tensions in Ethiopia are within that territory that was then Abyssinia. So, sort of, but not entirely. A little bit, you're missing a lot just by looking at this map, because it's not the divisions between these 3 regions of Abyssinia, the Gala territory, and the Somali territory. Those aren't where the ethnic divisions in Ethiopia tend to fall today. Although there are divisions between the Oromo and other groups in Ethiopia, and there's historically been conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia over the Somali majority areas of Ethiopia. This isn't really where those ethnic lines fall today.
Below this, we'll find the territory of Zanzibar clinging to the Swahili coast. Although I've never quite read this name before, I do know that not far offshore lies the island of Zanzibar, and I can't help but feel like these must be connected.
And he's right on that. What he doesn't realize here is that this word is not pronounced, or probably not pronounced, supposed to be pronounced Zanzibar. In Portuguese spelling, you'll often see G's pronounced as a J sound. So this is probably supposed to be Zanzibar, which is also where we get Zanzibar. That was also originally coming from the word Zanj, which is an Arabic term referring to people with people we'd consider black. It basically means black. And this is a pretty outdated term. It is sometimes considered pejorative, but that was regularly applied to people from the Swahili coast. So Zanzibar comes from the Zanj, and these are probably just two spellings of that same word. We've anglicized it to Zanzibar, but it's probably supposed to be pronounced Zanzibar in both of these cases. One is just a Portuguese spelling, and the other one is an English spelling.
At this time, Zanzibar was a bustling port made rich once again mostly through the dealing of slaves, taken from East Africa and bound for Arabia and beyond. This had been taking place for hundreds of years already, making the East African slave trade perhaps the oldest and largest operation of its kind on the continent. Its heart was this island.
Okay, so I don't think that's true. Now, I don't have numbers in front of me, but the East African slave trade goes back, hundreds of years, but so does the trans-Saharan slave trade. There were a lot of people shipped across the Sahara. And the East African slave trade was only one small part of the broader Arab slave trade. Now, if you consider the Arab slave trade as one single thing, yes, that was the oldest and largest continuous slave trade affecting Africa. However, if you just split off the East African slave trade, there's no way that outnumbers the Atlantic slave trade even. So and obviously it's just a small component of the larger Arab slave trade. So if you want to say the largest and the oldest, the Arab slave trade is probably correct, but that's the whole Arab slave trade, not just the East African slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade probably outweighs the East African slave trade in terms of how many people were shipped.
And countless raids were launched into surrounding lands, extending Zanzibar's domain into what would become known as Zangubar. And I think this is another too often overlooked chapter in Africa's history, as Arabs had been colonizing and slave trading in these parts for centuries by this point, while Europeans were still being terrorized by Barbary pirates.
Okay, so this is extremely misleading phrasing. This is missing a big chunk of the story in this region, because, you see, Zanzibar was conquered by the Omanis from the Portuguese. The Portuguese had already been colonizing in this part of East Africa long before the Omanis arrived. So that is not accurate framing. This did not come centuries before Europeans were in this area. The Portuguese took over Mozambique around 360 years before this map represents. So it was a very long-standing thing, right? And Oman conquered Zanzibar from Portugal in 1698. So the European presence in this region predated the Omani presence.
This is again worth noting because this horrible practice, the East African slave trade, was another moral justification Europeans eventually used to extend their own control into the region.
Although, once again, the Europeans were involved in this slave trade before the Omanis got there. Now, there was already a pre-existing African slave trade, but of course, at that time, before the 19th century, Europeans didn't care about it. They were perfectly happy to participate in it. It's only after Europe started moving away from slavery that suddenly stopping slavery became a justification for colonization. But the Portuguese had been directly involved in the East African slave trade and the Indian Ocean slave trade more generally. There were some East Africans who were sold to various other parts of the Indian Ocean by Portuguese slave traders, and even a few East Africans as well as Asians from the Indian Ocean region who were brought by the Portuguese as far as the Americas. So that's a little known fact of the slave trade, that a small fraction of the enslaved people who were brought to the Americas actually came from East Africa, although the significant majority came from West and Central Africa.
Famous explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley dedicated their lives to the goal of ending the Zanzibari slave trade, only for their efforts to end up facilitating the further exploitation of these lands at the hands of new colonial masters. Though, at least here on this map, the name Zanzibar preserves the memory of these Omani slavers and helps shed light on a time and place in Africa's history too often overlooked.
Okay, so that's slightly dubious framing because, once again, this name is, it is an Arab name, or an Arabic name, but it is in direct reference to the local black people. It is Zanzibar. It is named after the Zanj, the black people from East Africa. So, doesn't really preserve that, although at this time, this region would be controlled by the Omani Sultanate.
Continuing down the coast, we'll arrive at Mozambique, another name we should recognize, but as we can see, this version of Mozambique was much smaller than its modern form. Sadly, being directly south of Zanzibar, this area was subject to constant Arab slave raids, and so the area failed to develop any power structures of its own by the time the Portuguese staked a claim.
Okay, so that is a really weird thing to say. Once again, the name Mozambique, that is, ultimately it's coming from an island, but that is a Portuguese name that was being applied to this region. So the Portuguese already staked a claim there. The other thing is, they did have power structures. There wasn't just one state called Mozambique in this region, but there were a whole bunch of different powers in that area. So it's not accurate to say that nobody had developed power structures, and it is especially not accurate to say that they hadn't developed power structures because of Arab slave raids. That is just very inaccurate.
Here, they established their own island foothold on the island of, you guessed it, Mozambique, from which they launched their own incursions into the interior and took their own slaves. But unlike the Arabs, after reaping a harvest of slaves, the Portuguese remained on these lands and tried starting new business ventures such as plantations, establishing the colony of Mozambique, which had already existed for 200 years by the time this map was printed.
Okay, so the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, or, well, I don't know about the whole colony because they extended over time, but the Portuguese had been colonizing in this region for longer than that, for around 360 years at this point. But regardless, it is dubious to claim that the Portuguese were unlike the Arabs because they took slaves and then stayed. The Arabs also stayed. They were continuing slave raids through that period, but it's worth noting that, like, one of the biggest exports of Zanzibar, the island, was spices that they were growing there. And it wasn't settlers that were growing those things. It was local Africans who were under Omani control. But that's also true in Mozambique. It wasn't really settlers growing these things. So it's really not that different of a situation here. I'm not sure why he is contrasting these two things.
Below that are two more states I'm rather unfamiliar with, Monomamtapa and Sofala. Though in my defense, Monomamtapa is the outdated Portuguese term for what we now refer to as the Kingdom of Mutape.
Okay, so he adds a letter here. It is Monomotapa, or Monomutapa, or if you want to pronounce it more accurately to the modern spelling, it's Mwene Mutapa, which is actually the title of the king of Mutapa. So the state's Mutapa, the king would be Mwene Mutapa, but in Portuguese sources you'll often see the title of the ruler being applied to the state.
This was another rich and powerful pre-colonial African nation, and one of the surprising few whose wealth was attained not through the trade of slaves, but rather by operating a number of gold mines. Although this gave rise to a rich society based on something other than the exploitation of its own people, unfortunately
Okay, so that phrasing, I want to stop for a second, because that is really dubious phrasing. When he's talking about slave traders and then the exploitation of its own people. In most cases, when people were trading slaves, it wasn't their own people. It was people from rival kingdoms. It was people from neighboring countries. So not their own people. Now, a lot of these countries also had enslaved labor. I don't know that Mutapa didn't have enslaved labor. I'd have to look into that. Even if they weren't exporting enslaved people, they may have still been using enslaved people, kind of like the Kingdom of Benin. To go on a little tangent, the Kingdom of Benin cut off exports of enslaved men around the 1530s. So they were not really involved in the transatlantic slave trade. But the main reason they did that was so that they could preserve their own enslaved workforce. They were still using slave labor. So just because Manu Mutapa was not exporting slaves doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't using slaves. But regardless, the thing I want to touch on there is that phrasing of its own people, because when he's talking about the slave trade, that is usually other groups of people being enslaved and sold, not the people of the states selling those enslaved people.
Even deeper in the interior, we'll find several more poorly understood states, such as the Londa Empire or the Makololo people. Occupying the rugged interior, these groups proved a challenge for Westerners to understand or define, as they too were often warring with one another for regional supremacy.
Okay, so I just want to pause it for a second to comment on these visuals, because these people appear to be Central African foragers, or rainforest hunter-gatherers. The colloquial term that people tend to use is pygmies, very short people. Pygmies is often considered pejorative or a slur by these groups, so I'm using other terms. But these are very short people who live in the rainforests of Central Africa. These are a distinct group of people, so I think these visuals might be a little misleading. I feel like Atlas Pro is just using some of the historical stock footage he has available to him, but that might be a little misleading when he's talking about certain groups of people, but I believe this footage is actually showing other groups of people who are very different in appearance and lifestyle.
Causing land to change hands faster than explorers could report on it. So I understand why these areas were left vague and colorless. Another name I found interesting in this area is the Kazembe Reich, one more minor African kingdom that's...
Okay, so cutting him off there for a little bit just to comment on this name. It actually says on this map Kazembe's Reich. So I just want to comment on that because this is not a state called Kazembe. It is the state of leaders who were called Kazembe. Now, I believe this name, this was a personal name originally. I believe it was passed down through the dynasty. So it didn't refer to one single person, but whoever was in charge. But it is a name rather than the name of the state. So it's not a toponym, it is a person's name.
Below the lands of the Kazembe and the Lunda were the Bekuwanas, who also did not have a defined territory.
Okay, just to point it out, Bekuwana, again, pronunciation doesn't matter that much, but this is clear that the Tswana people, sometimes pronounced or spelled as Chwana. So it's Tswana, it's Bechuana, not Bekuwana.
Tswana people's ancestral homelands were further south, in what were then the countries of Transvaal, the Orange Free State, Natal, and Kaffraria.
Okay, so these are not all states. Kaffraria was not a state. Kaffraria is, I feel weird saying that because that is place of the Kaffirs. And if you know anything about South African culture, you'll know why I feel uncomfortable saying that. Kaffir that's actually an Arabic word originally. It means basically infidels. It means non-Muslims. But in the South African context, this was actually adopted as a term for black people. So Kaffraria means black people place, basically. This is not a state. This is just what they're calling this general region.
These weren't native African states, but rather were founded by the Boers, a group of Dutch settlers who arrived on the southern end of the continent 200 years before the making of this map.
And again, Kaffraria was not one of those states. That is what they were calling a place where black people lived. And to be clear, that is a pejorative. Kaffir, it is a pejorative in the South African context. It is a slur. So it's not It's not exactly a comfortable term to use, but that is why they're calling it that. It is not a Boer state. It is a region occupied by black people.
Initially, the Boers settled around the unpopulated Southern Cape, but
the Southern Cape was not unpopulated. This is actually a more important thing to note. This is a pretty popular myth today, that when the Boers arrived, there was nobody there. But there were definitely people there. Let me go back a little bit. The people seen in this image, these are indigenous people of the Cape. These are Khoisan groups. Now, the Khoisan, that is an umbrella category that includes the Khoikhoi people. That is also an umbrella category, including a variety of different indigenous Southern African groups who herd cattle and other livestock, and the San people, which is itself an umbrella category coming from the Khoi language, which refers to foragers. That is, people who don't rear livestock traditionally, but who hunt and gathered their food. So the Khoisan, that is an umbrella category for all those different groups of people. There were a variety of different Khoisan peoples living in the Cape region. Now, since they were traditionally fairly nomadic, they didn't have an established territorial bound. They moved around. So that's where you kind of get this myth that it was unpopulated. But it wasn't unpopulated. The people just didn't have permanent settlements. They moved around.
But eventually the British would take control over this strategic position, establishing their own Cape colony here. Unable to resist British aggression, the Boers fled the Cape for the interior, finding themselves on the lands of the Swana people. Here they established a handful of their own states, in turn displacing the Swana to the north, resulting in no sort of organized state, but rather a collection of refugees thrust into a new land.
Okay, so again, there were already Swana peoples in Botswana, and they had states. So it was not this was not a stateless territory occupied by refugees. There were some refugees, although also worth noting, a lot of those refugees came before the Boers. A big factor in the history of this region is the rise of the Zulu kingdom, and I have never heard this word said out loud, so I'm hesitating to say it. I think it's Mfekane or something like that, which means like the crushing or the trampling or something like that. It's a bad thing, basically. And that is when the Zulu kingdom rose after, or during and after the reign of Shaka Zulu. They displaced a lot of their neighbors as they were pillaging and raiding and attacking all of these neighboring regions. They conducted war in a very broad area around their kingdom, and that pushed a lot of people out of their territory. So there were a lot of refugees fleeing from this general region of southern Africa. Before the Boer states were founded, there were already people fleeing. The Boers contributed to that. They also, pushed people off their land. Also worth noting, not all of these people were Swana. They were part of a broader group, including the Swana, but also the groups like the Sotho. So this is a more complex situation than what he is describing here.
If you'd like to see the Cape Colony in more detail, it's the third and final map inset up here, letting us once again see the individual states of the colony.
And I'll note on this, you can actually see a state within that colony called British Kaffraria. So that's another example of that term being used. In this case, one of the subdivisions of the Cape Colony, but it's still being used as this general region that is just place occupied by black people. That's literally all that means.
While most of these aren't all that interesting, as they are again European-drawn administrative boundaries, I did manage to find one more neat name here: Great Bushman Land. This refers to the San people, otherwise derogatorily referred to as Bushmen, who represent...
Okay, so I'm going to pause that for a second, because this is, incidentally, an unusual case. The San people do not all consider the term Bushman derogatory. It's often treated as such, but a lot of San people actually prefer that term, because San is itself an exonym. That is a Khoikhoi word that means something like forager. So Bushmen, some of them actually prefer this because it stresses their traditional lifestyle. So that's kind of an interesting situation, because when we hear that, that sounds kind of like demeaning. It sounds like Bushman, like someone who lives in the bush, right? But to some members of the San peoples, this term just stresses the fact that their traditional lifestyle involves living off the bush, living off of the natural world. And some of them prefer that because they have often been alienated from this lifestyle. The majority of them do not still live in their traditional lifestyle. The majority of them are not hunting and gathering for their subsistence. A lot of them have been pushed onto reservations in modern-day African countries. So some of them prefer to stress that traditional lifestyle and stress that they have been, kind of separated from these traditions that they would like to be maintaining, that they've often been forced to end up dependent on the state because they can't maintain this traditional lifestyle. So it's a really interesting situation that is brought up by this term, Bushmen, which we generally don't use today, but some people prefer it.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you all know that if you've been enjoying these clips from the past that I've been including and you wanted to see more of them, I recently launched a second channel called Archive Dive, where I take a closer look at these old films. One of the programs I watched in preparation for this video was Jungle Yachts in the Belgian Congo, a record of the explorer Adjaye Gadi's efforts to cross Africa in some of the most bizarre vehicles I've ever seen.
Okay, so just want to note here, I think this is the reason for some of the odd visual choices in this video. I get that you want some stock footage to fill in the gaps, but I assume that a lot of the clips that he was using were coming from this documentary or this film, right? Which means that they're coming from the Belgian Congo. They're coming from what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Central Africa, which is a region this country, basically he didn't touch on. He briefly touched up on a few of the blurry borders in the middle. But if he's using clips from the Congo and representing other regions of Africa, that can be very misleading because, the Congo, Central Africa, the rainforest especially, this is representing one specific region of Africa, and the cultures there don't necessarily resemble cultures in other regions. Okay, so I think that covers everything I wanted to say about this video. Go show Atlas Pro some love. Even though I think that this video makes a lot of big mistakes, it also has some good stuff, so please go watch the original. If Atlas Pro sees this video, I hope that he appreciates some of these corrections that I've issued. I hope he sees that this is all in good faith. This is all about learning. We all make mistakes, so it's no big deal that he made these errors, especially when covering such a broad topic, as long as he, sees the corrections and learns from it. So I hope everyone who watched this video learned a lot. I hope you all enjoyed. And with that, my name is Soma, and thank you for joining me today. Alright, so I think that just about covers everything I had to say about this video. Now, I had a lot of complaints about this video, but it's worth noting that I probably skipped over plenty of stuff along the way, so please go and check out the original video to get the full context and see anything that I didn't have criticisms or corrections about. If Atlas Pro watches this video, thank you Atlas Pro, I love your stuff. If you want to do any future videos on African maps, by all means, reach out to me. I would be happy to fact check and help you out with any research on those subjects. And to everyone who watched this video, I hope that this video provided a good opportunity to learn about a bunch of random things about the African continent. If you'd like to learn anything else about African history, I have a number of videos about African history on my channel already, including videos about the Kingdom of Benin, the Kingdom of Ouagadougou, or the Ghana Empire, and the rule of Queen Jinga in the Kingdom of Ndongo in West Central Africa. And I have many more planned to come out in the future, so please feel free to check out the rest of my channel and subscribe for more. With that, I've been Soma, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.